Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. John and I are continuing our series talking about monster tactics. Today we're going to be talking about the Drow. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. John and I are going to be talking about Drow tactics in today's video. But before we get started, please make sure that you hit the like and the subscribe button, help us grow. And of course, make sure you're leaving some comments down below about things that you are enjoying hearing in this video. John, why don't you get us started? Drow are such an interesting topic. They're very popular. They've been around for a long time. Where do you want to start with this talk?
I think what I want to start with is the notion that we're going to talk about Drow tactics, but we haven't really talked about yet strategy. And I'm not going to get in real deep in this because we don't have time for that. But it's important to realize that the Drow think on a strategic level, and they also think on a tactical level. And that's not something that we've seen a whole lot of in most of the monsters we've talked about, or most of the humanoids we've talked about. Hobgoblins have a lot of this, where they have a larger plan and they work to achieve goals. Drow do the same thing. And I think it's important for DMs in general to think about Drow, or when they think about Drow, to think about the larger strategic purpose of any engagement that they willingly involve themselves in, because they're not goblins that are just like, ooh, something shiny, I'm going to attack it and kill it and murder it and just kind of have this, orgasmic action of murder and mayhem. That's not what the Drow do. There's cruelty to them. There's, all those things that we associate with the Drow, but they still have a very strict hierarchy. And that hierarchy is very important to the way that they come about doing their planning and engage with enemies.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction to be made between some of the other monster creatures that we've talked about. And I even have difficulty probably thinking of Drow as monstrous because they're not monstrous in the same way.
Not
Earlier
anymore.
editions,
I mean, they used to be. They used to very much be that way in the earlier editions where they were a monster, and then Dritz and all that came along and they became less monstrous.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Earlier editions, they were much more monstrous, but the newer editions, you see them as, much more detailed than what they were prior. One of the things that I think about in terms of the Drow, just right off out of the gate, is that I like to think of Drow, which I know not every Drow is a ranger, but I like to think of them in the same way that we talked about our ranger strongholds, that oftentimes when you're fighting Drow, you're fighting them in their world. I mean, it's in the Underdark, it's in their locale, it's in their land that they understand. And in many ways, the Underdark is like their stronghold from entrance to exit, like all the way through. They know it very, very well. And you have to think about how they utilize that terrain to their advantage because you're in their backyard. And in a similar way, that's what we were talking about with rangers and their strongholds, being a forest where they just know the ins and outs of their terrain. The Drow function in a similar way.
Yeah, I would say that that's largely true for the areas that they're able to keep control of, but there are denizens of the Underdark, the Dwergar, the Mind Flayers, those types of creatures that, there is that competition for space, but they're very familiar with what most surfacers would consider to be alien aspects of the Underdark, and I think that that's kind of what you're referencing there, just in terms of the importance of understanding that they're going to understand how to use the 𝐹𝐺. They're going to understand the other less intelligent or monstrous or animalistic types of creatures that inhabit the Underdark and make use of them in ways that are beneficial to them. And they use those things to help protect and guard the areas of the Underdark that they control. They understand that, there is a huge pit of spiders and things like that inhabit a certain region. They don't go and try and clear that out because that acts as a defense mechanism for their home, for their city. And they do this in a number of places. They do the same thing with the 𝐹𝐺. They put their outposts near them. They put their strategic like slave holdings and things like near those, because they're difficult to scry through, and it's almost impossible to accurately teleport into or out of those areas as well, and it creates just this layer of defense, which, like you're talking about, has to do with the specific nature of the Underdark and where they're inhabited.
And one of the things you're talking about, which I think is very important as well, before we start jumping into some of the specific tactics that Drow utilize, is that they're not always looking at going toe-to-toe with adventurers. They're using some of those features of the Underdark to their advantage to maybe weaken adventurers or lead them into traps or what have you. Really, what comes to mind is thinking about when Gollum, leads Bilbo up to the spider. I can't think of the damn spider's name.
Shelob.
But to have this, Shelob, thank you, to do the damage to take him out in order to reap the reward and let somebody else doing his dirty work. And oftentimes the Drow are looking for other creatures. Maybe it's their slave armies. Maybe it's the pit of spiders. Maybe it's some other feature of the Underdark that they're leading you to do the dirty work for them to then reap the reward, depending on what it is that they're trying to aim strategy-wise.
Right. So there's a couple of things there that I do want to point out. They're very intelligent in general, which, whatever. So anyway, they're very intelligent.
In general.
I started to interrupt myself with weird thoughts. They're very intelligent, they're careful, they're pragmatic, and they're goal-oriented, which means that they're hunting adventurers. They're going to set up ambushes in an intelligent way. They're going to try and use, like you said, the terrain and other resources as well as possible. They're going to attempt to achieve their goal in confronting the PCs, which primarily, for the most part, is probably going to be taking them as slaves. They're not particularly interested in killing any humanoids unless they have to, if they can find value in them. Because it's much more valuable to have a powerful adventurer as a slave to bring that back to the city than it is to bring back the dead body and whatever gear they have. Because they can have the gear and the slave, and it's better to have both. They also understand that if they confront the PCs, they don't necessarily have to win that fight. They just need to win the battle. So they may engage the PCs, they may poke at them, they may, like you say, send in their slaves initially because they want to see what the PCs can do. So they go, there's these PCs wandering through the Underdark. Let's go send in a bunch of goblins. Doesn't matter if they live or die, we've got thousands of those. So they send in a bunch of goblins and they go, wow, the PCs are throwing out fireballs, they've got this magical sword, I saw one of them was a cleric. So they've identified the very specific people in that party before they themselves ever engage with them. And then when they're ready to engage the party specifically, they know who they want to target. They know who the most dangerous members of the party are. They know that the cleric, is walking in the middle, and so they're like, okay, so when we ambush, we're going to wait until that cleric gets in close, and 5 of us are going to shoot that cleric with sleep darts immediately to try and take them out of the fight before we engage them. Those are the types of complex ambush tactics that I think that the Drow are capable of executing that something like a goblin is not. The goblin is very clever about ambush tactics, but they're not going to come up with a specific plan and try and get reconnaissance and that type of information first.
Yeah, I think that when we were talking about goblin ambush tactics, it's more instinctual that they utilize, where it's much more cognitive when you're coming to the Drow and how they're planning that. You did mention one thing that I think that is very important to utilize within tactics that I think separate the Drow apart from maybe others that we're going to be talking about in the future, in that they use things like sleep darts. They use poisons. They use whatever alchemical-based items they can use to, again, gain the advantage in that encounter in order to essentially enslave these people, knock them out, comatose them, and then bring them back and utilize them without having to risk ourselves to the point that we are worried about our own death.
Right. And they use anything. They do not have any compunctions about fighting fair. It's not about that. If they realize that there are 4 adventurers that are going to bring 12 drow, they're going to bring 20 drow, they're going to bring 20 drow and 20 slaves. They are not going to try and fight fair. If they feel like that party is capable, they're going to seek to overwhelm immediately, and they're going to use whatever tactics they can. So they send in their goblins to soften it up. They then target the specific people within the party with sleep darts. They target the wizards with the sleep darts and the clerics with the sleep darts, because they know they're more susceptible to those types of attacks. You know, metagame speaking, they're Constitution saving throws, and they know that the wizards are not the physical forces that are up front. Hit them with sleep darts. You take out the wizard, he's useless. You take out the cleric before the cleric can start healing any of the frontline fighters, and then they engage with the actual fighters with magic that's going to stun them or paralyze them or do other things. They understand the mental style attacks on the fighters, the physical style attacks on the casters, and then they mop up the rest with whatever works.
Yeah. Now, one caveat to this, if you really just want to see your players go toe-to-toe with Drow, you're going to have to set up a storyline and a direction so that the Drow are in, circumstances they wouldn't normally find themselves in that lead them into having to fight toe-to-toe. Because if you're looking at actually utilizing them the way that they're supposed to be utilized in regards to these tactics, these are the things that you're going to incorporate that we're talking about, so that it is one of those things where they're just overpowering the adventurers in whatever way they can. And we talked about this a little bit prior to starting the video, and I think this is important to mention in regards to the society. The Drow themselves have a society where they want to have a certain status or stature based on their house and some recognition for that. That doesn't necessarily mean that they hand-to-hand took out the biggest guy or brought in the biggest slave. It means that they made a decision or used the right strategy or the right tactics to bring in the biggest guy. They were the mastermind behind whatever it was that ended up bringing that guy in.
Right, and that's something that I was kind of talking around, I think, a little bit earlier, just in terms of they're more interested in winning the battle, or the war, rather than the battle. They'll do things, and they will prolong that to keep themselves alive, because their own mortality is important to them. They are selfish in that regard, just like any of us are. They want to stay alive. They're not going to throw away their lives to try and defeat the adventuring party or to accomplish a goal for their matriarch, necessarily. If they can avoid it, they will use every tool at their disposal in order to do those things. And that's kind of what you're talking about, where it's like, it does not matter how they got from point A to point Z. It matters that it got done. And once they get it done, that's all that really matters in the end.
So I feel like we've thrown a lot out here. We've kind of put the Drow up on a pedestal and talking about how to approach combat with them. Let's say that we have a game master that is wanting to put together an ambush party of Drow onto adventurers. Who would you include in that ambush party? Who are the Drow going to bring with them in regards to the makeup of classes that are going to be in that ambush party?
Well, primarily the males in the society, from recollection. I know that some of this stuff has been tweaked with newer editions and things like that, but primarily the males are fighters, or they're members of the Academy of Sorcerer, I believe, which are wizards, and then the females are clerics. And they can be fighters, and they can have some other, like, they're going to have a mixture of other classes in here, but this is very broadly speaking, this is where they go. So they're going to have their frontline fighters. These are the members of the society who must, in order to be a powerful male member of society who is a fighter, you have to be exceptionally skilled at that. Otherwise, you're kind of frontline infantry.
Yeah.
The wizards have value, again, if they're particularly good at what they do, but males are always below females in terms of just the way the society is structured. If you're talking about a very proficient raiding party, or a very proficient slave hunting party, it will probably be led by a cleric, and that cleric is the one who is in charge of the outpost or whatever. She may have an outpost in which she sends out groups of her soldiers. that are primarily male that would go out and do something, and she probably would send out a female that would be the commander of that unit as well. And they would go and hunt slaves, or they would go and hunt and raid to the surface. Anything that's going to be a surface raid, I want everybody to keep in mind this will only be at night. Drow are not going to go raiding during the day. And it's the same thing that we were talking about earlier, where if they're going to go raiding to the surface, it's going to have a larger goal. They're going to be doing it in overwhelming force, and they're going to be aware of accomplishing that goal and returning within the time allotted. This is not just, oh, we're going to go murder some random villagers on the surface because we can. They're going to the surface for a reason. It might be to get slaves, which is a fine purpose for them to go up there. But as soon as they get them, they're coming back, and they're not going to take unnecessary risks, because the slaves aren't more valuable than the lives of the drow that they have as a part of that, or at least not the important drow.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And a couple of other things. I know we're probably running close on time here, but I want to make sure that we get these in there. Drow use stealth, as you're talking about. They're looking at accomplishing things through the use of stealth. This could be sneaking around. This also means that they may be using invisibility potions in order to gain that advantage again during the course of battle. So knowing that they're going to utilize that. For your magic users, you may focus on spells that are kind of lean toward their civilization, their culture. So things like web, things like darkness, and casting out those. And then the last thing that I really want to make sure that we point out is that they always have a contingency plan for escape. They are going to have a tunnel system to get back out of whatever the battle is, an escape route of some kind in order to retreat if things don't go well in the course of battle, or they find as though they're losing that battle in some way. Again, they aren't going to just stand there toe-to-toe and fight to the death. If they're losing, they're going to leave.
Well, so you were talking about like potions of invisibility. They oftentimes the scouts and the assassins are going to have 𝐾𝐨 cloaks, which do aid in their stealth ability. So it is important to remember that. Also, in terms of communication, Drow are famous for their hand signs, which is basically just elaborate. I don't want to say ASL, but
sign language,
yeah, sign language. Thank you. But they have sign language, so they're able to communicate back and forth without speaking. So you basically have a group of individuals that have traditionally have magic items that give them stealth abilities. They have the ability to communicate across large distances so long as they can see one another without creating any sound whatsoever. And like you said, they're prone to ambushes. So they'll send in assassins, they'll send in ambush units, they'll do whatever it is that they need to do, but they're very careful about their movements, and so they're very difficult to find. And then traditionally, at least in the older editions, they also were armored very well. So it was either, their light armor could be made out of spider silks, or their heavier armors could be made out of like adamantine. And the result of that is that they are well geared, well equipped, well trained, exceptionally patient, and have a plethora of resources at their ability. They're careful about their engagements. They're tactical about their engagements, and they always have larger strategic goals for anything that they actually do. So they're a lot of fun from a DM perspective, and they should be a nightmare for your players.
Yeah, and so if your players win over that nightmare, they have to earn it. I think that's that's the thing to remember. If you're going to bring in Drow, make your players earn that victory, because they should have to earn that. All right, well, I think that's what we have today then on Dungeon Brew. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. Leave a comment down below. Let us know what your favorite encounter was that you've had with Drow, or that you've set up with Drow in your campaign. And we will see you guys next time.
Dungeon